I must warn you before we begin. What I'm about to tell you is not the Rome of shining marble columns, triumphant generals, or golden laurel crowns you've seen in textbooks. This is another Rome, a Rome of whispers in the dark corridors, of power that poisoned every heart it touched, and of an emperor who became its most dangerous addict. This is the story of Nero, Rome's most infamous ruler. And at the heart of it lies an obsession so grotesque, so unthinkable, that even the chroniclers of his age wrote of it with hesitation, as if their ink itself recoiled from the truth. Stay with me, for once you hear how far Nero descended to satisfy his desire, you'll realize Rome's grandeur was only a mask. Behind it lay shadows darker than history ever wanted us to remember. Rome, the 1st century after Christ. The empire stretched farther than any before it, across deserts where the pyramids watched the sun burn the horizon, over seas where merchant ships carried gold and grain, and into the misty forests of Britain where tribes still resisted Roman steel. At the center of this vast machine sat a single man, Nero. A boy who had inherited more power than any mortal should ever be trusted with, an emperor crowned in youth, worshipped by flatterers and feared by his enemies. But Nero's legacy was not victories, nor wisdom, nor justice. It was cruelty, excess, and the shadows of madness that seemed to cling to his every step. By his 20s, Rome whispered that he had murdered his own mother, Agrippina, the woman who had placed the crown on his head, that he had exiled or executed rivals, silenced senators, and filled his palace with sycophants too terrified to speak a word of truth. And yet, for all the blood he spilled, it was the death of one woman, his beloved wife, Poppaea Sabina, that would drag him into his darkest obsession, an obsession so strange, so grotesque, that even Rome's most scandalous rumors pale in comparison. Poppaea Sabina. Her name carried through Rome like a song. To some she was beauty itself, her hair gleaming like gold under the torchlight, her voice soft enough to soothe an emperor. To others she was cunning, ambitious, a woman who rose higher than anyone expected. But to Nero, she was more than wife or empress. She was his prize, his possession, the one thing he could not imagine losing. And yet, he lost her. Ancient whispers tell us that in a sudden fit of rage, Nero struck her down. Some claimed it was a brutal kick, ending both her life and the unborn child she carried. Others softened the story, calling it an accident too dangerous to tell plainly. But the truth mattered little. Rome knew only this: the emperor himself had killed the woman he adored most. Her absence hollowed him. The palace that once echoed with her laughter now fell silent. Statues, paintings, tributes, none of them were enough. Nero did not crave memory. He craved her presence. He longed for her breath, her touch, her voice in the night. And so grief twisted into obsession. Death had taken Poppaea, but Nero refused to accept it. From that moment, his madness deepened, and the most grotesque chapter of his reign began. Imagine the emperor of Rome, absolute master of legions, temples, and gold, wandering his marble halls like a restless shadow. By day, he commanded the empire. By night, he was haunted by a single absence. Nero tried everything to fill it. He raised statues of Poppaea, ordered sacrifices in her honor, and filled the streets with processions meant to keep her memory alive. But no matter how many fires burned, no matter how many voices praised her name, the silence in his palace only grew heavier. And then, Nero did the unthinkable. He began to search, not for a queen, not for an ally, but for a vessel, a living mirror that could carry the ghost of the woman death had stolen. His gaze fell upon a boy, not chosen for rank nor for power, but for his delicate features, the softness of his frame, the uncanny resemblance to the empress who could never return. The boy's name was Sporus. To Rome, he was just another youth, but to Nero, he was no longer himself. In the emperor's eyes, Sporus was to be transformed, remade as Poppaea reborn, a grotesque reflection shaped not by love, but by madness. The boy was taken into the very heart of Nero's palace, where marble columns rose like sentinels and golden light flickered across the walls. Servants draped him in flowing silks once worn by the Empress Poppaea, fabrics dyed in deep purple and crimson, colors reserved only for imperial blood. Around his neck they placed jewels that had once rested on her skin, until the child looked less like himself and more like a living echo of the woman Rome had lost. But for Nero, clothing and jewels were not enough. He craved transformation. Ancient writers whisper of a command so cruel it defied belief. Sporus was forced to endure an operation that stripped away his manhood, reshaping him into the image Nero demanded. From that day on, the boy's life was no longer his own. He was trained to walk as she had walked, to speak with her tone, to bow with her grace. Every gesture was rehearsed until the illusion was perfect, and when Nero gazed upon him, he no longer saw a frightened child in borrowed silks. He saw Poppaea returned, or rather, a shadow of her, bound forever to serve the emperor's twisted grief. Rome gasped when the news broke, an announcement so absurd it bordered on blasphemy. Nero, emperor of the greatest empire on earth, had staged a wedding, not to a noblewoman, not to a foreign princess, but to Sporus, the boy he had reshaped into the ghost of his dead wife. The ceremony was public, lavish, and disturbingly familiar. Sporus was veiled like a bride, draped in flowing silks and crowned with jewels once belonging to Poppaea. There were vows spoken aloud, gifts exchanged, and even a dowry presented, as though this grotesque parody carried the same weight as any royal marriage. The people of Rome whispered behind their hands, some in horror, others in bitter laughter. The emperor has married a corpse returned from the grave. Senators muttered in private, soldiers stared in disbelief, yet none dared challenge him. But Nero did not care. In his mind, the union was real. He paraded Sporus proudly in gilded chariots through the streets, calling him Empress before the eyes of the world. To Nero, this was resurrection, a delusion so complete that even death itself could be denied. And Rome could only watch, powerless, as madness itself sat crowned upon the imperial throne. What must it have been like for Sporus? A boy torn from his life, stripped of his name, forced to wear the mask of another. He was no longer free. He was a reflection, a shadow shaped to satisfy the emperor's obsession. Every step rehearsed, every word measured, every glance watched by the most dangerous man in Rome. Outside, senators whispered in disbelief, soldiers muttered that the empire was cursed. Inside, Sporus walked through marble halls glittering with gold, yet each room felt like a prison. The courtiers laughed, but behind their smiles lingered fear and silence. For Nero's affection was not love, it was possession. His obsession wore the costume of devotion, but beneath the jewels lay cruelty. And though the empire feasted, though the emperor sang and paraded, Sporus endured a nightmare dressed in silk. Behind every smile was silence. Behind every crown was cruelty. And beside the emperor's hand on his shoulder, Sporus knew the truth. He did not live beside a ruler. He lived beside a monster. But obsessions like this could never last. Rome grew restless. Rebellions flared on the empire's borders, senators whispered of curses, and even the legions began to turn their backs. At last, the Senate declared Nero an enemy of the state. The emperor who once believed himself a god was suddenly a fugitive in his own empire. As soldiers marched on a palace, Nero fled, trembling, to a lonely villa outside the city. There, abandoned by almost everyone he once ruled, he chose to end his life by his own hand. The man who had drenched Rome in fear and spectacle left the world in silence. And what of Sporus, the boy forced to live as a shadow of the dead? He survived Nero, but not his curse. Passed from noble to noble, he was compelled to relive the illusion, wearing chains that were not made of iron, but of memory. His fate became Rome's darkest mirror, proof that in the empire of Nero, innocence itself was the first sacrifice. And so, Nero's darkest obsession was etched into history. Not the splendor of his golden palace, not the flames that consumed Rome, not even the intrigues of politics, but the tale of a boy, stripped of his own life and forced to become the shadow of the dead. When we picture emperors, we see crowns, victories, marble statues shining in the sun. But behind the polished stone and the gilded thrones were truths far darker, stories of obsession, cruelty, and madness wearing the mask of glory. These are the chapters history tried to silence, yet they still whisper across the centuries. So I ask you, when we remember Rome's emperors, are we honoring rulers, or are we recalling monsters dressed in gold?